Hi, Monte. Hi, Manuel. Hi, Silvana. Fine, thanks. You? Welcome.
Thank you so much. We're so excited about this.
Yes, we're excited too. It's a big experience for our group. Manuel is a colleague from the University of Litoral in Santa Fe, and Silvana is the creator of our group, Silvana Di Camilo. She's a professor in the University of Buenos Aires and La Plata. And well, I'm living here in La Plata.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for creating the group. And do either of you know my soon-to-be new colleague, Patricia Marischal?
No, I don't know her.
So my university, my department, has just hired an Argentinian ancient philosopher. She got her PhD at Harvard, but she's from Buenos Aires.
Oh, I don't. Do you know her, Manuel?
Yeah, she's.
You are silent, Manuel.
Anyway, I believe it or not, have only met her over Zoom. So
yes, believe it.
We're yet to actually meet in person because she was planning on coming over to visit, but then she had to go back to Buenos Aires. So anyway, we'll all be getting to know each other, hopefully.
Yeah, yes. Pandemics, ways of meeting people.
Yes, it just makes everything so weird, but.
Yes, and now it's strange when you meet someone in person to talk without a mask. Yesterday it was so strange. Someone I met for 2 years speaking with mask, and now I can't realize it's the same person.
I read a study that said that apparently we're all more attractive with masks than without.
Yeah. Definitely.
Definitely me, but I was surprised to find out it's generally true.
No, but it's true for all of us. Yes, we're waiting people to come to the meeting. Yes, I think we start. We don't have time for this meeting, so we don't have problem. But yeah, I know you must go. But I tell that it's an open meeting.
Oh, and how often do these meetings take place?
Monthly, but sometimes we take more than a month and a half. But the next month, Manuel Berron will talk with a colleague from Italy about the politics. They will do the next conference. And I wish Pierre Destre comes in July to speak to us.
Yes, our mutual friend, Pierre.
Yes, Pierre, and David Constant is here also.
I see that. That's great. Greetings, David.
Welcome, David.
Hello, everyone.
It's a pleasure.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Hello, Doug.
Hello, David. Where are you flying in from? Where are you?
I'm in Providence at the moment.
In Providence. All right.
Which of the 150 countries that you've traveled from are you in now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll be in a few others soon. Hello, Monte.
Good to see you.
Yes, gracias, David, por estar presente. Sé que tenía un compromiso, pero,
Sí,
pero bueno.
pero
Así que bueno, si puedes acompañarnos un ratito, después siéntete libre de visitar a tus amigos y tus compromisos laborales o sociales.
Es un placer verte, Viviana.
Es un gusto. Creo que hay gente, there are people from different countries that are in the list, from Mexico, Chile, Argentina, I don't know if someone from other country, but America. And so we are waiting just for the other people to enter.
All these people, I don't know them at all, complete wonderful strangers. Although I do recognize the name of Matteo Stetler calling in from Deakin University in Australia. I've been in touch with him before. And,
Yeah.
And Claudia Cajaro, I've read her work before. So I recognize a few of these names.
Now come Giulia Angelini from Italy. Yeah. Thank you, Giulia.
During the pandemic, I had a seminar over Zoom where one of my students was in South Korea and the other was in Serbia. And so one of them was in the middle of the night while the other, one was at the beginning of the night, the other the end of the night, and in the middle of the day, all at once, totally different time zones.
But we have 4 or 5 hours from San Diego and Vancouver.
Yeah, 4 hours.
4 hours. Okay.
4.
And Providence, Italy is 1 hour, and Italy 5 hours. Yeah.
The other way.
Mm.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. I think we can wait just 1 or 2 minutes more and we start. Yeah.
So, Viviana, can I ask about these questions? You asked for questions and you created some questions and maybe translated them into English for us. And we saw these questions about half an hour ago. And wow, they're really good questions. Whoops, they're good questions. When are we going to take these questions up? Are we going to give our presentation and then just?
Yes, we asked the members of the group to prepare, but the public can make questions too. So the idea is a short presentation. I will present you and your work and your huge project, and then you can I give you the words to your talks, and after that we can start with the questions, and the public can make them, and the group have prepared the ones I told you, but we expect that the public, the audience, will make them. Okay, after your talk.
Yeah, because there could be fresh questions about our replies to those questions, and it should be an open discussion, of course.
Okay, but I prefer if you can give your talk and then we.
And then talk about it.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, that's
okay.
what we were planning. Yeah.
Okay.
If we read everything in the paper, it would take maybe 3 hours to do that. But we're not going to do that. We're going to.
Okay. Yes, but it was very nice of you, very generous to give us the paper so we can read carefully and prepare and to be in contact with your work. And so for us, it's easier because not all of us speak English. I don't speak English actually, but it's easier for us. So thank you so much for your generosity.
Well, it's actually, I want to say mutual thanks, because you made us write this stuff out. And yet we also need it for 2 further written documents. One of them is under development and is due in a month or 2. And the other one is the final product, which we're trying to finish. And so this is, this document seems so much work in progress because it is work in progress. You know, some parts are very sketchy and some are more developed, and so we actually decided now we're going to start right here in Argentina.
It's a work in progress after 20 years of work, so it's a very big work in progress. It's enormous one. So if we can, yes, thank you, Monte, for sharing the link. we share with all of the members of the audience, so they have the paper. And I think I can start with the presentation. Bueno, hablo un poquito en inglés y otro en español, ¿sí? Buenas tardes y bienvenidas y bienvenidos a este primer encuentro del año del Grupo de Estudios Aristotélicos. Para quienes no nos conocen, el grupo se conformó en el año 2019 por la propuesta de la doctora Silvana Di Camilo, y está integrado por investigadores y estudiantes de distintas provincias de la Argentina. Forma parte del Centro de Investigaciones Filosóficas y cuenta con el auspicio y el apoyo institucional del Instituto Ezequiel de Olazo, CONICET. Este ciclo de conferencias se inició en el año 2020, gracias al cual hemos tenido la posibilidad de escuchar a destacados especialistas. En primer lugar, les agradecemos a todos los asistentes provenientes de distintos países del mundo por su interés y por estar presentes en este encuentro virtual. Hoy nos honra la presencia de los profesores Douglas Hutchinson y Monte Ransome Johnson, quienes generosamente han aceptado nuestra invitación. Welcome, Professor Johnson and Hutchinson. Greetings. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for sharing your work with us. We are also happy with the presence of our colleague and friend, David Constant. We are honored with your presence today, and it's a great pleasure for us to have the possibility of listening to you speaking about your meticulous research about Aristotle's Protapticus. Before you start your talk, I would like to present your work and a short summary of your huge programs about this lost work. Antes de pasar a escuchar la conferencia sobre la historia y recepción del Protréptico de Aristóteles, voy a presentar brevemente un resumen sobre la trayectoria de ambos investigadores y de su ambicioso proyecto de investigación. El profesor Monte Johnson es profesor en la Universidad de Carolina, en San Diego. Su investigación se centra en la filosofía greco-romana y su influencia en la historia de la filosofía y la ciencia. También se dedica a comparar dicha filosofía con otras tradiciones y literaturas de la sabiduría antigua. Además de la reconstrucción del Protréptico, investiga la influencia de Demócrito en la filosofía helenística. Es autor del libro Aristotle on Teleology, publicado en Oxford en el año 2008, y de numerosos artículos y contribuciones en obras colectivas, entre las que se destacan The Cambridge Companion to Aristotle's Biology, del 2021, The Cambridge Companion to Ancient Greek and Roman Science, de 2020, Le Héritage d'Aristote aujourd'hui, Nature et Société, editado por Pierre Pellegrin en 2020, y The Cambridge Companion to Lucretius, de 2010. Por su parte, el profesor Douglas Hutchinson estudió filosofía antigua en Oxford, donde se desempeñó como docente. Durante 33 años enseñó filosofía en la Universidad de Toronto, alcanzando el título de profesor emérito. Actualmente se encuentra retirado y vive en la isla de Vancouver. A lo largo de su extensa carrera, sus intereses de investigación se han centrado en la filosofía antigua, especialmente en su recepción en la filosofía y ciencias posteriores. Sus publicaciones incluyen The Virtues of Aristotle, en Routledge, 1986, Aristotle's Ethics en Cambridge Companion to Aristotle, editado por Barnes en 1995, es editor y traductor al inglés del célebre libro de Carlo Natali, Aristotle, His Life and School, publicado en Princeton en 2013. Es editor asociado junto a John Cooper de Plato Complete Works de 1997, y también es autor de la introducción de Epicurus Reader, editado por Hackett en 1994, y está disponible en línea. Desde hace casi 20 años, los profesores Hutchinson y Johnson han iniciado el vasto proyecto de reconstruir esta obra perdida de Aristóteles, reevaluando todas las posibles fuentes de evidencia, lo que los ha llevado a recorrer las principales bibliotecas y universidades del mundo con el propósito de cotejar manuscritos y presentar los resultados de su investigación. Su minuciosa y exhaustiva labor de reconstrucción textual, la originalidad de algunos de sus aportes y el descubrimiento de nueva evidencia han determinado su reconocimiento internacional, constituyéndolos en referentes insoslayables en el estudio de esta obra. Fruto de este trabajo conjunto han publicado dos importantes trabajos, Authenticating Aristotle Protapticus, publicado en Oxford Studies in Asian Philosophy en 2005, y Protreptic Aspects of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics en The Cambridge Companion to Aristotle Nicomachean Ethics, publicado en 2014. En la página web que los profesores Hutchinson y Johnson dedican a este proyecto, que es www.protepticus.info, pueden encontrar estos ensayos y trabajos inéditos. Generosamente han puesto a disposición de la comunidad académica su versión más reciente de la reconstrucción provisional del texto, un resumen de su análisis de la evidencia textual, el índice de su edición crítica, traducción y comentario. Su investigación ha puesto en tela de juicio aspectos centrales del estado del arte, en especial el canónico intento de reconstrucción propuesto por Düring en 1961, lo cual ha permitido redescubrir y revalorizar este texto perdido, sacándolo del ámbito olvidado de las obras fragmentarias, a las que prácticamente nadie lee, como ellos dicen, y recuperándolo en cierta medida la importancia que tuvo en la antigüedad debido a su profundo significado como una exhortación a la filosofía entendida como forma de vida. Professor Johnson and Hutchinson, we are really excited to listen to your conference about the history and reception of Aristotle's Protapticus. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viviana, for setting up this conference and for such an eloquent introduction and really making us look so good, better than we perhaps are. And thank you to the whole audience, especially for your effort to comprehend such arcane matters while we're speaking to you in a foreign language. We've already presented this research in the United States and Canada and Mexico, as well as the UK, France, Belgium, Italy, Greece, and the Czech Republic. But this is the first time that we've addressed any audience from Argentina or indeed anywhere in South America. And in the Protrepticus, Aristotle says that wherever in the inhabited world someone sets down thought, it touches the truth on all sides equally as if it were present there. And so let that be the case here too. Doug and I have been collaborating on this project, as you say, for 20 years. It began when he was Professor Hutchinson to me, and I was a lowly graduate student at the University of Toronto, also where I first met David Constan, and where Doug and I first read Iamblichus's Protrepticus together in Greek. And we were so inspired by the Aristotle sections that we immediately formed an intention to produce a translation and reconstruction of this material for our students. You all know how hard it is to introduce Aristotle to young students, especially after having just shown them the literary brilliance of the Platonic dialogues. The rebarbative prose of Aristotle's esoteric works can actually be a kind of apotreptic to his philosophy for young readers. And at the time, we naively thought it would be a simple and straightforward matter to just churn out a translation. We had publishers that were interested and so on. But as we looked further into it, we realized that much more research was actually needed, and in two opposite directions. First, reassessing what had already been attributed to the work, and better defining the limits and extent of that material. And second, researching what else might belong to the work, what other ancient sources may have preserved information about it. To our surprise, this work had not been completed or accomplished, and at the time that we started working on it, had virtually been abandoned by other scholars. One of our closest colleagues even discouraged us from wading too far into this muck and mire. But today's talk is a summary of the results of our collaborative research into this work over the last 20 years. And the paper that we've sent you is a conspectus of the introduction to our forthcoming edition, translation, reconstruction, and commentary on Aristotle's dialogue, the Protrepticus. Now, I'm going to very briefly summarize the first 5 or so pages of the paper that we sent you, and then later we'll read sections from the paper and invite you to follow along. On pages 2 to 5, we summarize what we take to be the status of the question. To make a very long story very short, too short perhaps, the modern history begins with Bywater's discovery in 1869 of citations of Aristotle's Protrepticus in the fairly obscure work by Iamblichus of Chalcis, also entitled the Protrepticus. That work of Aristotle's was early on enlisted in the war that was raging over Aristotle's development and that occupied a significant part of 20th century scholarship on Aristotle. For the first half of the century, there was a steady accretion of an attribution of new material to the work, culminating in Ingmar Düring's 1961 attempt at a reconstruction. That's the title of his book. But Düring's failure to discuss all of the evidence that was available to him and his insistence on reordering the work in accordance with his preconceived conception of its literary genre and of Aristotle's development led to enormous skepticism about the recovery of Aristotle's Protrepticus. And by the time Olaf Gigon published his new edition of all of the fragments of Aristotle's work in the revised Berlin edition of 1987, the evidence taken into consideration for reconstructing Aristotle's Protrepticus had all but disappeared. And that brings us to our research and to our 2005 publication in Oxford Studies in Ancient Philosophy that Viviana referred to, which we call the OSAP article. There we proved 3 points that are crucial to restoring the evidence base and reconstructing the lost work on the basis of a very close study of Iamblichus's techniques of excerpting from known dialogues of Plato and other works. First, Iamblichus does not ever alter or interpolate his source material except to excise dialogue from it. Second, Iamblichus excerpts from one work at a time and proceeds through that work in its original order until he moves on to another work. And 3, Iamblichus always indicates where there's a gap in his excerpted material by providing perfunctory transitional comments. Thus, we advocated employing a negative method of removing Iamblichus's transitional comments, and what remains are pure blocks of quotation in the original order, unaltered except to excise dialogue. This is what we call genuine fragments of the work. Now, in the rest of today's talk, we're going to focus on the reception of the work in later ancient authors, including Iamblichus, and discuss how that affects the entire evidence basis for reconstructing the work. Then we will show you how we propose to document that evidence in our forthcoming edition and commentary, and our method of reconstructing the lost work itself, and distinguishing between documenting the evidence for its reconstruction and the reconstruction itself. After that, we will discuss the relation of the Protrepticus to the corpus of esoteric works of Aristotle, and briefly discuss what light the former can cast on the latter. Time permitting, we'll exhibit some of the new material that we attribute to the work and include in our reconstruction, and discuss how it relates to different works in the Aristotle corpus. So I will ask Doug to begin by telling us about the reception of the Protrepticus in ancient authors, and turning to page 6 of the paper that we sent.
Okay. How's my voice? Is it clear enough? Okay.
Sounds good.
I just want to start my remarks by picking up a question that was given to us, number 9, in fact, the last question. And prefacing my remarks, after its prolonged loss over many centuries and the different deaths to which the work has been subject, since it's the very thing that Monte has been talking about, since its discovery by Bywater in 1869, do you believe that your reconstruction will finally allow this lost dialogue to be recovered by removing it from the shelf of fragmentary work that nobody reads and putting it onto the shelf where people teach with it, right? And really understand it and work with it. Do you really believe that this will happen? So the question really is a question of, do I believe that our work will have reception and acceptance in the community of scholars around us and in later decades, right? Why would we ever believe that when previous great scholars had their hopes disappointed? No, I think it's I've been thinking about that question because what it means is that we're facing a job of tremendous difficulty and great risk. It's really would be a bad plan to drop this baby a second time. And so what is the technique that might arrive at a solid reception and acceptance of our work? They are, I would say, two. Unlike During, we don't work alone. We work as a research couple. Number two, unlike During, we don't work in isolation. We work in transparent collaboration with other people, like you folks in Argentina and Mexico, Colombia, and other places, and we make a practice of going to places, at least virtually, but in past actually, to face questions, to make sure that people were satisfied in our replies. And so the other difference is that we work very gradually, and we don't believe we've got the solution within 2 or 3 years of research. And it's the gradualness, the collaborativeness, and the teamwork aspect that I think would allow us to produce work that actually does and can achieve permanent acceptance. And if I didn't believe that, then I would stop working on this project. Really no point in putting this much work into this kind of project if it's not going to be accepted. And so, yes, it is my faith. It is. Okay. So we're going to talk about the reception of the work in the ancient world. Why that? Because it's within the reception of the work that all the evidence for the work resides. And different kinds of reception produce different kinds of evidence. And within different kinds of evidence, there can be different kinds of nature, I would call textuality, in relationship to the text, and therefore different ways of being or not being a fragment. And that relates to questions one, tell us more about fragments and evidence. Now, of course, the Protapticus is a lost work, and most of ancient literature and philosophy is a lost zone. If we had more of the Protrepticus or more of the subsequent literature, we could tell you much more about the reception of it, and it would have been a very long and interesting story to tell, I believe. But there are various ways in which we can't know because of these various dimensions of loss, and so we're left with what we have. What do we have? We're in the middle of page 6. We have limited conclusions. The limited conclusions that can be reached about the ancient reception of Aristotle's work fall into several groups. A version of its literary structure and a selection of its details were appropriated and reworked by Cicero in his Latin Protaptic to philosophy, a dialogue of competitive speeches called Hortensius. And that was Bywater's route into the text. A selection of passages was made by Iamblichus in his Protrepticus and his other Pythagorean textbook anthologies, using literal quotation for speeches and modified citation for dialogue passages, which resulted in an effacement of its literary structure. Then later, Proclus uses many sources in his Euclid commentary, one of which is the Protrepticus, but he may have had indirect rather than direct access to the dialogue, since he attributes certain Protrepticus details to Aristotle, who wrote them somewhere. Several papyrus fragments contain texts that plausibly or probably derive from Aristotle's Protrepticus, but since these are merely fragments, it is not known whether they're fragments of a manuscript of the work or fragments from some other work that cites Aristotle's words. Certain passages of the dialogue had a focus on slogans, maxims, and proverbs, and these dense expressions of wisdom were collected in anthologies, but since they were stripped of their provenance when anthologized, there is currently no way to assign some of these and not others to Protrepticus. Aristotle's Protapticus was definitely known to Epicurus, who took opposed positions and made different distinctions, not the least in his own Protaptic works, but most of the works of Epicurus are lost, and nothing reliable can be inferred from those works about any of Epicurus's philosophical predecessors, whose views he tends to distort for polemical purposes. Now, and that's all. I mean, only in these sort of pockets and streams and rivulets of ancient tradition do we find evidence of this lost work. All the evidence for this lost work is lodged in one or more streams of ancient reception, but different types of reception yield different types of evidence with different degrees of reliability. If we are to speak of fragments of the lost work, these must be texts that reliably preserve the words in the form that Aristotle wrote them, because paraphrases or other transformations can attest only to the ideas contained in the passage, not to the words themselves. This is obviously true where the later texts are in Latin. These words could not possibly have been written by Aristotle, yet fragments 10a, 10b, and 10c in the Walzer and Ross collection contain Latin texts as if they were proper parts of Aristotle's text. Fragments of it. In the pursuit of reliable fragments, our first decision must be then to dismiss all Latin texts as being merely evidence, potentially shedding some light on the lost text in virtue of the manner of its reception, but they are not fragments and obviously could never have been. For different reasons, we can't get all that much more out of Cicero's Hortensius. For different reasons, again, we can't get much out of Epicurus' evidence, although there's some interesting connections to be made there. The evidence collected in fragment 2 of Walzer Ross about the miraculous arguments is reliably connected to this work because Alexander Aphrodisias says it appeared in the Protrepticus. It seems likely to me that Alexander had direct access to this text, Protrepticus. There may have been only indirect access to the lost work on the part of the late ancient scholar Olympiodorus, who gives a very brief report of the argument, the miraculous argument as found in the Protrepticus. And we believe that both Elias and David did not have direct access because Elias refers to the work entitled Protrepticus as if he was unfamiliar with it, and David because he locates the argument in some Protreptic composition of his. So our decision will be to gather these and other related reports about the miraculous argument into a collection of texts that give evidence about the phase of the lost dialogue, but no fragments can be extracted from the evidence. This is despite the fact that it's Exhibit 1 in Gigon. The passage from Stobaeus, collected as fragment 1, Walzer Ross, is essentially a report about the reception of the work in Crades and yields no fragments or even any reliable information about the content of the work. And even the report that was just commented on is, in fact, difficult to interpret. So the result of all these exclusions, I'm systematically paring away evidence that cannot be fragments. The result of all these excisions is that we don't have any of fragments 16, 17, 18, and 19 or 20 in the Walzer Ross collections. They all get relegated to subsidiary evidence or potential further evidence. The only fragments that remain are what they collected as the miraculous argument report, the dedication report of Stobaeus, and the sequence of passages collected from the Protrepticus, including one passage from the DCMS 26. So now we're on page 9, if you want to follow along. And when we start from the position of Gigon, for example, let's take that as our starting point. All we have is the miraculous argument plus the Stobaeus dedication. But this position changed in 2005 with the publication of our OSAP article, which authenticated 6 to 12a as a series of selections literally cited or accurately paraphrased with their order preserved from a lost work of Aristotle that could only be the Protrepticus. So when we add this large quantity of evidence to the 2 small items in Gigon's collection, the original reports that were known before the 19th century, we achieve a huge increase in the quantity of authenticated evidence. This provides a large spine or series of fossil remains onto which to attach further scattered evidence by relevant verbal and intellectual connections. At this point, the authentication of other evidence becomes feasible when it wasn't before. Both the evidence previously collected by other editors and new evidence yet to be discovered, and also some recently discovered. Now, the first extension of this evidence base beyond those 6 to 12a chapters, the first extension is in chapter 26 of the third title of the Pythagorean sequence of the Iamblichus. In fact, there was 10 titles in this, and titles 5 to 10 are missing, but the first 4 survive. The first is the Pythagorean life, second is Protapticus, and third is this one. The middle portion of chapter 26 of this DCMS is a slightly reduced doublet of the last portion of Protapticus 6, which was already authenticated by us. So it stands to reason that the other portions of chapter 26 also derive from the lost work, because we discovered that Aristotle worked 5 chapters. The first part of this chapter is already accepted in the 19th century collection of Rose, as well as in Walter Ross edition, but Düring removed all but a few sentences from this evidence because it contains a voice that's to a large extent hostile to Aristotelian views, and Düring could not reconcile this voice with his conception of the work as a monologue speech, the Isocratean oratory. Now, this was a mistaken removal on Düring's part, and we have restored it as a fragment. In fact, the best argument for this, if you don't mind me advertising our work, is in the 2018 piece on apotreptic and protreptic, where we go into why this is a mistake for Düring to remove this evidence. We studied the end of chapter 26 and confirmed that the source of Protapticus, so it hadn't been seen before. The fact that the whole of one chapter of our DCMS contains citations from the Protapticus raises the possibility or probability that other chapters left and right, before and after, might contain citations. But before we get into that, let's review where we are so far. We have authenticated fragments from 26 in DCMS and from 6 to 12a in Protapticus. But there was a problem with Protapticus 8, which Düring placed at the ending of the work in his scrambled rearrangement. The voice in this chapter, however, is unmistakably different from the voice in the other chapters, in that it expresses Pythagorean commitments, proposes a doctrine of the soul that is not Aristotelian, in fact, contradicts Aristotelian views, and concludes with a frenzied climax, after which it is hard to imagine the speaker coming back in the dialogue with any major contributions. And yet the dialogue nevertheless continues and reaches another, arguably more elevated conclusion in chapter 12. So there must be at least 2 speakers, one of whom finishes in chapter 8, the other in chapter 12. The dialogue assumption is confirmed by the discovery that the Iamblichus citations are in order and display 2 separate rhetorical climaxes. And there are also fossils of dialogue in the Aristotle chapters, just as there were in Iamblichus's modified citations from the dialogues of Plato. And there are further reasons to believe in the dialogue hypothesis when you see the degree of intertextual mutually answering of issues and images between the 3 speakers. So now for us, the speculation on the part of a few 19th century scholars, plus Jaeger, plus Düring, speculation with an honorable set of champions, the speculation that it was a piece of oratory in the Isocratean way is now disproven and should be discarded.
And yet, Isocrates does loom large in the work, but in a different way, not as influencing its form, but as a character, as a speaker in the dialogue. The critical voice in the opening pages of DCMS 26 expresses ideas that are familiar from a group of works by Isocrates in which he took issue with Socratic teachers of philosophy, and then with Plato in his academic approach. And it was Allen who first suggested that in Aristotle's dialogue, the Protrepticus, there might be a character that is or stands in for Isocrates. And this is proven to be an insightful suggestion. Allen's suggestion is richly confirmed by the terms in which Aristotle replies to Isocratic views and passages from Isocrates in DCMS 23, Protrepticus 6, and Protrepticus 9. So now we have at least three characters in the dialogue: Isocrates, whose view is opposed by Aristotle in chapters 6 to 7 and 9 to 12, and by the speaker in chapter 8, who we haven't identified yet. Aristotle expresses himself in at least partial agreement with Isocrates, however, at the beginning of Protrepticus 6, before the part of his speech where he defends academic philosophy against the repeated attacks of Isocrates. Now, I skip a little bit and mention that the speech preserved in Oxyrhynchus papyrus number 666 we attribute to and interpret as being in the voice of Isocrates, and this speech seems to have been stimulated by an opponent of philosophy, an absolute opponent of philosophy. And the proposal that there was such a speech in hostile opposition to the entire practice of philosophy offers the best explanation for the so-called miraculous argument. As a declarative argument, it isn't at all valid, but as a competitive maneuver in a dialectical context, it was impressively effective. If an opponent of philosophy gives intelligent arguments against doing philosophy, he then opens himself up to the retort that by giving intelligent arguments about fundamental ideas, he's already doing philosophy. And so after all, one must do philosophy. This locates the episode of the so-called miraculous argument early in the dialogue, after which three speakers respond, first agreeing about and then disagreeing about what exactly it means to do philosophy. We think we know how Aristotle responded to this challenge, and we think we know in what terms Isocrates responded to the challenge, but we have no evidence to indicate what the third main speaker said in response. This third main speaker is the one who is cited in Protrepticus 8. The person is a card-carrying Pythagorean who thinks in Pythagorean terms and uses Pythagorean imagery and models, and actually refers several times to Pythagoras. The style is vigorous to the point of fulmination, reaching a trifold fervid climax that invites his audience to go ahead and die unless they can do philosophy. He's revealed to us to be Heraclides of Pontus in chapter 9, in which the character Aristotle agrees with this third speaker that, quote, Pythagoras was right to say that the reason a human being should choose to be born is to be an observer of the sky, the heavens. This was part of his answer to a question posed to him in Phlius, as we learn from the chapter heading composed by Iamblichus for this chapter, and it is independently known that Heraclides of Pontus told this very story about Pythagoras in Phlius in his work entitled Diseases. This detail identifies this fulminating, vigorous Pythagorean as Heraclides of Pontus, and shows that Aristotle is interested in parodying this voice of a literary rival, as well as the voice of another author in his dialogue, Isocrates. It's a comedy that often goes by way of parody. Now, at this point, we've named three pro-philosophy characters, as well as an unnamed anti-philosophy speaker, and our fragment collection has been expanded from Protrepticus 6 to 12a to include all of DCMS 26 and Oxyrhynchus papyrus 666. The speaker in Protrepticus 9 to 12 is Aristotle, certainly, but this was not at all obvious for the material in Protrepticus 12b, which has a speculative or even religious quality. It was thus rejected with ridicule by Jaeger, and in our 2005 article, we actually agreed with him. But now we have changed our minds. We now see it as a formal peroration in the voice of the character Aristotle, as Aristotle is known to reach conclusions by raising the rhetorical level to the heavens, even in esoteric works. This is one of the texts that we've prepared for discussion, and it's discussed also in a forthcoming publication by Doug. with arguments for its acceptance as a fragment. So at this point, all of Protrepticus 6 to 12, along with DCMS 26 and Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 666, are to be considered fragments of the work. Now let's turn to the DCMS.
All right, so I'm going to try this. It was unfortunate that during rejected, here I'm on page 12 in the second paragraph. It was unfortunate that during rejected without giving reasons and apparently without much consideration of the arguments for the attribution of DCMS 23 to the last dialogue made by Maryland. DCMS 23 is, of course, several chapters away from DCMS 26, and Maryland, in his work From Platonism to Neoplatonism, was studying that, and he, in one chapter of that book, he said, I think this has got thematic and linguistic connections with the lost work Protrepticus. So we had, of course, to go back and study that chapter, which had been proposed by an eminent scholar. And when we did examine that chapter, the Voice of Aristotle was really pretty strongly heard. There were evident references to, as well as attacks against Isocrates, and the conclusions of the speech were highly consonant with the rest of the authenticated fragments. We agree with Festugère, who a few years later accepted and celebrated Maryland's discovery. And this chapter 23 is also part of our material that we're going to discuss at the end of this talk. But it raises an obvious question. If there is Protapticus material in 23 and 26, then what about the intervening and the outside chapters? In the Protapticus, it's like going into a mine. Once you find a vein, you go left and right until you exhaust it. In the Protrepticus, we found that Iamblichus kept using his source text until he stopped using them, which implies that DCMS 24 to 25 must be from the same work, and the same might be true of the surrounding chapters. When it comes to 24 to 25, we do believe that, and there is some complication because of the overlap of VP 18, but since we're not concentrating on that today, I want to skip over that paragraph and go to the next. Our collection of fragments has expanded to include DCMS 22 to 25, as well as 26. The latter part of 26 is clearly in the Voice of Aristotle, certainly. So the question arises for DCMS 27, whether this voice continues. The first part of this chapter contains a very surprising phenomenon, an indisputable intertextual connection between the opening of this chapter and the opening of the On Parts of Animals 1. Again, we're going to illustrate that phenomenon at the end of the talk. The next part of the chapter contains further comments in the Voice of Aristotle that are tailored to be directed against the views of Isocrates, and there are clear parallels in Non Complicated Ethics 1. The last part of the chapter also contains relevant replies in favor of academic philosophy against the aspersions of Isocrates. Close study of the opening section shows that Aristotle, in writing the first section of his On the Parts of Animals, has consulted a copy of his own Protrepticus and modified these sentences so as to indicate the conceptual foundation of the new subject under investigation, namely functional anatomy and zoology. And again, this is something that we are put out there for discussion at the end of these comments.
Now,
so, that brings us to the end of that section about the reception of, and so it was over to you, Monte, right?
yes, all I want to do is point out on page 13 or 14 of the PDF, section 3A. This is a small part of the paper, but it's the part that has cost us the most amount of work. It took us about 20 years to write this part of the paper, okay? And what this is how we plan to present the entire evidence base of what has been attributed to the dialogue. And we include papyrus fragments here from several papyri, 4 or 5, the citations to Iamblichus that we've just been discussing, and the reception in Greek authors and then in Latin authors, beginning with Cicero and other Latin authors. And finally, on the next page, proverb collections and proverbs that are attributed to Aristotle that we think appeared in the Protrepticus. Now, the crucial thing about this is we've assigned these catalog numbers to these, and this includes all of the pieces of evidence that have ever been attributed in any article that we know of, or any research that has been brought to our attention about the Protrepticus. So somebody working on this problem can go into our edition, get an edition of this material and a translation, and here are comments on it. This is independently presented from the idea of the reconstruction of the work, which I will ask Doug to discuss, and following the outline on the following page.
Yes, if you can follow me on to page 14, there's a title that says the current Protrepticus reconstruction is an ordered sequence of text as follows. So let's talk about the difference between a collection of fragments and a reconstruction. A reconstruction is a particular sort of text collection which has a structure to which there's sufficient confidence. And it's also, of course, a decision about what to reject that previous scholars have accepted, if there are any. And so that's the way this works. As you can see, this is starting with a dedication to Themiston at the front of the work, a speech against philosophy. We think that's in P2 perhaps, or similar. Then there's arguments in reply by Aristotle in those miraculous arguments. And then there's a speech in favor of philosophy. I think that's in the Voice of Socrates. And then it looks like there's alternating speeches between mostly Heraclitus and Aristotle, with one more speech about Socrates. And so it's clearly a dialogue in the Ciceronian pattern of where authors and intellectuals trade fairly long speeches. And that makes sense because Cicero said that he wrote his dialogue in the Aristotelian pattern, where intellectuals trade their views in long speeches. After that sequence, and that's the core, that list there is the core. There's some evidence that we want to be not quite sure whether to authenticate. There's some evidence we're not quite sure yet what the location is. There's there's some evidence in the Amicus DCMS to evaluate. That's research in progress for the future. But this is, and so the spine of this may expand slightly. One of the advantages of separating a reconstruction order from an inventory numbering system is that there are reasonable disagreements that one could make about the place of this or that piece of evidence. And so it's not reasonable to doubt that it's evidence, but it's not reasonable to doubt where it goes in the reconstruction. And so one could have versions of this reconstruction equally plausible or valid perhaps, without disturbing the fundamental collection of evidence in the numbering of them as PCR. I like to call this the PCR test. You know, have you done a PCR test recently? This has got a papyrus, citation, or reception, one or the other. So yes, the reconstruction that we're moving towards has this shape and shows a dialogue of these speakers in alternation. And that brings us to the end of the presentation about the past scholarship and our current plans for scholarship. And the next section is about an equally important aspect really of the whole field. How does the fact that Aristotle wrote Protrepticus, how is that consistent with the rest of his work, his published work, of which you know quite a lot? How does it fit into that? And so all of section 4 is work in progress towards answering that question, the presence of protreptic ideas, rhetoric, and materials and discourses in the Aristotle corpus. So I think I'm going to go forward and tell you what's on page 15, giving you I'm skipping over the first paragraph, I'm suggesting that, no, I shouldn't, because there's a question on this. Sorry, there's a question on this very point. A Protapticus to philosophy, this form of writing seems to have originated with early intellectuals, those whom Plato called sophists, as a way of informing the public about their special skills and motivating them to learn those skills despite the investment of effort and money. A key example of this genre is Isocrates against the sophists, in which he disparages Socratic teachers, among others, and praises his own teaching, all the while displaying the sort of thinking and writing in which he himself, Socrates, is capable. Plato took some unconventional approaches to Protreptic in his works, displaying it as a dead end in his Pythagoras, if this is his work, and in Euthydemus displaying the sophistical tricks of certain sophists as betraying a genuine exhortation to philosophy. In the hands of Plato and Isocrates, it was an experimental form of writing, not a fixed genre, and the same is true of Aristotle's dialogue. Not much light is shed on his lost work by studying and applying genre expectations to it, and this is what led Düring and Jaeger to reach the wrong conclusions that it was an Isocratic oratory. One of the ways in which Aristotle was influenced by Plato was that he aimed to be a creative writer, and creative writers experiment with genre expectations. So we will not devote further attention to the wider study of the genre, which has been recently illustrated in a group of studies, not just our essays, but many other excellent studies collected in When Wisdom Calls. And in response to the question on this topic, why are other scholars so obsessed with the genre, fixing a genre of Protreptics? I think that goes back to the time when the genre of Cicero Hortensius was meant to be a clue to the genre of Aristotle's Protrepticus. And in general, when people thought that genres were somehow codes or styles or shorthands or ways of writing prose. But anybody who reads Plato's Phaedrus knows that Plato has contempt for rule-based generation of prose, and also that Plato has huge respect and practiced the art of novelty. Furthermore, Socrates is always talking about novelty in rhetoric and novelty in literary form. So I would say it's more or less a fixed point of this rhetorical genre of Protreptic philosophy that it does not have a fixed genre, that it's always seeking for novelty and at least some kind of development and change. And so I think that it's actually just a mistake in practice to try and find the essence of it, because the essence of it is a historical process. Okay, so I want to say one more thing on the case of Aristotle, why we're not studying the wider history and the earlier Protreptics. It's because all you have to do is look to Aristotle himself in Rhetoric 1, chapters 4 to 7, whose surviving comments are the classic statement of rhetorical theory about Protreptics. It's possible that he formulated his ideas about Protreptic rhetoric before writing his Protrepticus, and this is consistent with the reports that he taught rhetoric in the academy when Plato was still alive. But to us, it's more likely that he had internalized the principles of Protreptic rhetoric when writing the Protrepticus, and then formulated them for the purpose of later instruction in rhetoric. Certainly the theory conforms to the practice, as far as we can tell from surviving evidence, so closely that it seems to have been modeled on his own experience.
So beyond that direct discussion of the Protreptic genre officially in Aristotle's rhetoric, there are two other kinds of major interaction between the Protrepticus and the Aristotle corpus. One of them is the recycling or reuse of ideas from the work Protrepticus in various parts of the corpus. The second is the examination of what parts of the corpus contain Protreptics of any kind to further study, and also which ones don't. And looking at where Aristotle does and does not offer Protreptic to further study gives us an interesting gauge as to his own conception of which sciences were already developed enough and already being followed enough, and which ones needed more encouragement. Now, we have noticed several different kinds of recycling and reuse of Protrepticus material in various works of the Aristotle corpus. And we have made a checklist of all of the ones that have been presented in the earlier literature, including Jaeger, Düring, and so forth. And we have made an attempt to estimate which of these really are references to the Protrepticus, which of them might be a reference to another exoteric work, and so forth. And it would be impossible to summarize that material here, but the result of our study is that it seems that Aristotle has redeployed ideas from the earlier Protrepticus in various arguments of various surviving works, especially the beginning of the metaphysics. That's the most famous case that Jaeger considered to be an unedited recapitulation of part of the Protrepticus. The second is the first book of Parts of Animals, which turns out to have an intertextual relationship to the earlier Protrepticus. The second book of the Physics, the opening of Politics 7, the opening and closing sections of the Nicomachean Ethics, and throughout the Eudemian Ethics, especially books 1, 2, and 5. Now, as for why protreptic passages are very rare in the corpus, we're not people who, working with a hammer, see everything as nails, working on the Protrepticus, see Protrepticus everywhere in the corpus. In fact, we raise the question, why is it so rare? Why does Aristotle not offer protreptics, conventional protreptics, to the virtues or to many of the sciences that he explores at length?
In fact, the only surviving passages that can be said to be truly protreptic in character, here I'm on page 17 in the second paragraph, the only ones that are really protreptic in character are the Protrepticus philosophy and political theory at the beginning of Politics 7 and the end of Nicomachean Ethics 10, and the Protreptic to Life Sciences on Parts of Animals 1. The prominent exploitations of Protrepticus material in metaphysics and Eudemian ethics, however, do not seem to be part of any protreptic discourse, nor do we find protreptics to rhetoric, to the logical treatises, or to the main physical and astronomical subjects. How is this to be explained? What are the factors that explain the general absence of protreptic discourse in Aristotle's corpus with only these exceptions? Well, protreptic discourse aims to stimulate motivation and commitment to a new enterprise on the part of those who are not committed to it and are reluctant or maybe reluctant to do so. Perhaps philosophy is unattractive to them because they feel it's barely feasible or is full of disagreement and uncertainty or holds up the prospect of frustration rather than pleasure or for some other reason. A publicly released book such as Aristotle's Protrepticus will end up in the hands of many readers. Many or most of them reluctant to change their way of life and join an establishment of philosophical research. So therefore, it's relevant to Aristotle's purpose in this book to address these readers and inspire the new commitment in the face of their understandable reluctance. But there's no reason to believe that Aristotle's esoteric works were intended to be publicly released. On the contrary, his designation of the published works as exoteric is meant to distinguish them from the esoteric works, those intended for the internal consumption of his colleagues in the Lyceum. There's also no reason to believe in the presence of uncommitted students or the existence of courses of study for the wider public in most of the esoteric works. On the contrary, they reveal that Aristotle is conducting research in the presence of colleagues who are already committed intellectuals. The only courses of study that were addressed to a wider group of external students, according to later reports, which I think are largely correct, were courses held in the afternoons on rhetoric, political theory, and ethics. When the esoteric works address other topics, we have to assume that they have an internal audience of colleagues who are involved in the research and who have already committed themselves to philosophy, which would make a protreptic irrelevant. Based on this consideration, one would expect properly protreptic discourses in some of the published works, the Protrepticus and perhaps others, and in the esoteric works that address external students who came to the Lyceum to learn about rhetoric, politics, and ethics, but not elsewhere.
Now, this suggestion is sufficient to explain most of the observed facts. So it explains why there's either no protreptic to First Philosophy and Metaphysics 1, or there is a very particular and attenuated protreptic to First Philosophy in Metaphysics 1, despite the heavy recycling of protreptic material there that was noted by Jaeger. Those for whom these writings were intended were also committed to this subject, and there was no or little resistance and reluctance to overcome. The same reason explains why there is no protreptic to natural philosophy in Physics 2, again, despite the fact that Aristotle uses principles from the Protrepticus to help found his new system of natural science. The same reason also explains why there's no protreptic to ethical philosophy in the Eudemian Ethics, not even in EE1, which is stuffed and replete with borrowings from Protrepticus. It is a first attempt by Aristotle and colleagues to articulate the first principles of an ethical science, as is shown by the experimental steps taken in EE2. There's actually no reason to believe in the presence of students at the EE discussion, and there are a number of indicators that they were not present, so the absence of protreptic discourse in this work is also to be explained in terms of the intended audience. And this suggestion also explains why we actually do find protreptics to political theory and to philosophy in Politics 1 and in Nicomachean Ethics 10. These works were directed to external students who were already interested in rhetoric and politics, but may have been reluctant to engage in political theory in a systematic and scientific way, and probably were reluctant to engage in philosophy in any deep Aristotelian sense. If they had any interest in philosophy, it was probably at an elementary Isocratean level. Isocrates had died, and his school had closed a few years before Aristotle moved to Athens and joined the Lyceum, and the students whom he and Theophrastus attracted to the Lyceum were primarily interested in the practical subjects that provided prospects of social and practical advancement, namely applied rhetoric and elementary political theory. There was no need to provide a protreptic to rhetoric for this group, since there was already plenty of motivation for the activity and ample demand for the training, which explains the absence of any protreptic to rhetoric in Rhetoric 1. So that suggests the following explanation for the distribution of protreptic passages across the surviving Aristotelian corpus. None of his surviving works that were developed in collaboration with colleagues and composed for the benefit of the Lyceum community, including physics, most of metaphysics, and Eudemian ethics, are provided with protreptic passages, with the sole exception of On the Parts of Animals 1, for which a special explanation must be provided, since PA 1.5 contains an unmistakable protreptic, which stands out in marked contrast to the technical, aporematic, and methodological remarks of its surroundings. Two of his surviving works that were developed or revised so as to meet the needs of an external Lyceum audience, Politics 7 and Nicomachean Ethics 10, are provided with protreptics that he developed out of Protrepticus material, protreptics to philosophy or to a philosophically informed political science. He does this to supply motivation for possibly reluctant members of his audience so that they will aim higher and share his intellectual commitments.
So the special case of parts of animals will be discussed at the end of the section shortly, but for now I want to consider the special case of the double treatment of ethics in the Eudemian ethics and the Nicomachean ethics. We consider the Eudemian ethics to be a Lyceum research work, and the Nicomachean ethics to be a student-facing revision of the Eudemian ethics. And more needs to be said about this question, which interacts with the thorny issue of the disputed books that are common to both manuscript traditions. Now, the findings about the presence of protreptics in the two ethics is consistent with and supportive of views that we had already reached on this question as follows. And these are not necessarily universal among all scholars, but this is certainly my position. I think it's Monte's as well. EE 4 and 5 follow the first three books and together constitute EE 1 to 5, the ethics in 5 books that was recorded in the Hellenistic book catalogs, the work of Aristotle and commented on in the Magna Moralia. They were transferred from this context where they belong to the end at NE 4 where they do not belong. NE 1 to 4 form a unit that's best explained as a revised version of the parallel material of EE, but the end of 4 is missing. fragmentary, and NE 8 to 10 form a unit that is best explained as a reordering and revision of parallel material in EE 7. The evident gap between NE 4 and NE 8 was filled by ancient editors, I think in the Andronicus edition, with 2 supplements, EE 4 to 5 and EE 6. The NE was designed to be the first part of a 2-part course on ethics and politics, specifically designed for external students. And this is why the last chapter, NE 10, is an anti-Socratean protreptic to an Aristotelian treatment of political science. And this explains why the NE finishes with the clipped starting words of the next sentence, the one that starts the promised political discourse. So let's say, beginning. It's odd that these last words of the NE have not been commented on more, but there it is. Those are the last words of the NE. So let's say, beginning. So in our view, the NE is a hybrid artifact made at a late stage out of pre-existing and recently discovered documents, whereas the EE is a damaged artifact that fell at an early stage into several pieces, as laid out following. Now, on this conception, the book on intellectual virtue, EE 5 or NE 6, is seen to be part of the Eudemian ethics, and this makes a considerable difference to the question of the relation of the Protrepticus to Aristotle's ethical works, since this discussion is heavily indebted to Protrepticus' ideas, as is and as are all the other Eudemian chapters. There is extremely heavy intellectual influence from Protrepticus on EE1 in particular. So our conclusion is that the main influence of the NE is the EE, and where they both display Protrepticus' ideas, that's because the later is following the earlier. The only cases where the Nicomachean displays the presence of Protrepticus' ideas or passages where the Eudemian does not are precisely those 2 cases where Aristotle reaches for a protreptic passage to provide motivation for his external students, the audience for whom he has revised this material. There are numerous references to the Protrepticus in the Eudemian ethics, as is appropriate to a Lyceum work, but we can find no definite references to the work Protrepticus in the Nicomachean revised books. The 3 works of ethics that Aristotle composed contain many of the same core doctrines, but the discourses containing his thoughts were composed for 3 different audiences with several different needs, different sources of reluctance, and different ways of becoming motivated to change their way of life.
So we're almost done with the presentation, but we have one protreptic passage left to explain, the one in On the Parts of Animals, Book 1. Although this was an esoteric work, if there ever was one, it contains a protreptic. Why? His colleagues and co-investigators were already committed to a life of philosophy, scholarship, and science, so they didn't need another dose of that kind of protreptic. They did not need any protreptic to their study of astronomy, which is why the De Caelo does not need a protreptic and does not have one. But they do seem to need a protreptic to functional anatomy and zoology. Part of the reason is that this is clearly the birth of a new science. So Aristotle could not count on any pre-established motivation. It might be thought that this was not a tractable subject and it needs a protreptic to show that it is in fact feasible. But another reason is the nature of this particular subject, the bodies of non-human animals. Even his Lyceum colleagues might feel various forms of reluctance to take on that subject. Simple squeamishness is one reason. Another reason might be social. It's not the social role of gentlemen to handle animals, especially dead ones. That's what their servants who do the cooking are for. It would not be pleasant for many of his peers to enter into a dissection, and Aristotle needs a countervailing protreptic consideration that his study actually brings pleasure. It's remarkable that that protreptic stresses the pleasure that is to be obtained by engaging in this kind of study. The prejudice against lower animals was so strong in academic circles that Plato seriously believed they were just degraded and demoted human beings punished for past transgressions. On the contrary, for the Platonists and apparently for Aristotle, the heavenly bodies are divine above the human level. And in chapter 23 of the Protrepticus, which Merlin had proved was part of the lost work, Aristotle gives a stirring speech with grand balancing clauses in the style of Isocrates about the glories of the heavens and the rewards of astronomy, and celestial ideas and aspirations are very prominent in the rest of the dialogue. Now, when it comes to lowering the gaze from the beautiful celestial objects in the sky to focus on the seemingly ugly animals around us on this earth, the old protreptic clearly does not apply and a new one needed to be developed. Aristotle motivates his reluctant would-be zoologist by comparing this new study to astronomy, using ideas from the Protrepticus for a new protreptic to a new study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hutchinson, Professor Johnson, for your clear and exhaustive and stimulating exposition. We've learned a lot about the rediscovery and reception of this lost work, and your work is very valuable for us because it allows to observe the general and difficult process of preparing a critical edition. We also want to thank you for your generosity in sharing your paper with the audience, giving us the opportunity to read carefully and prepare questions in advance. In fact, the members of the group have prepared many queries, but if the audience want to make questions, we prefer that if they want to ask now, or we can start with you answer many of the questions we prepared, because le digo a la gente, los profesores me pidieron si podía justo unos minutos antes darle las preguntas que habíamos preparado a los miembros del grupo, y entonces yo se las envié, y algunas las fueron respondiendo, no sé si se dieron cuenta los miembros que habían hecho algunas preguntas, entonces ellos fueron respondiendo algunas de esas preguntas, pero bueno, si hay preguntas del público, y si no, comenzamos con algunas de las que todavía no fueron respondidas. Creo que Monte me está entendiendo lo que digo. Yes, you understand that we can start if nobody wants to ask now, we can start. I thought David wanted to ask, but the first question, I don't know if you referred, the first part of your paper, you make a distinction between testimonies that are evidence and testimonies, namely those of Iamblichus, that are fragments. In addition to the use of the Greek language that you referred, you exclude everything in Latin. Which are the main strategies that you use to recognize Aristotle's own words? Las preguntas las formulamos en inglés, pero bueno, les digo para los que yo los podría ir copiando, me parece que para el público sería más fácil, pero la primera pregunta refiere a cómo ellos distinguen los testimonios de la evidencia. Ellos han dejado afuera todo lo que es en griego, fuera de la evidencia, y le preguntamos cuáles son las otras estrategias que emplean para esta distinción entre evidencia y testimonio.
Okay, so let me try to answer that in an indirect way. The fundamental objective when using Iamblichus as a source text and the cover text, where the cover text is the Protrepticus, is to distinguish between the voice of Iamblichus and as the author of that larger work and the embedded text, Aristotle's work. And the main techniques we use to make those distinctions have to do with the position in the chapter. The fact that chapters are made by Iamblichus as chapters, and that he uses the front and the back and a couple of times in the middle to distinguish fragments. So our technique is...
People might be interested to learn that according to Sigons, this is the first work of philosophy in which the author designated his own chapters and apparently provided his own titles for chapters.
Yes, in a certain sense, you can think of it as the world's first textbook of philosophy, where a textbook combines texts from previous respectable contributions to the subject. And so it's the first textbook. And so we can, when you ask, if you ask them, where would you find the editor's voice in a textbook, look to the chapter headings. That's where you find the editor's voice. Okay, you take those away, and what's left is the source text. That's the fundamental trick. There's position. There's also style. Iamblic has a rather particular style, which is metatextual and flat and repetitive, and has no particular structure and has no balancing clauses. So once you take away the things that look like they're Iamblic, what you're left with is, I think, is Aristotle's words. And the words that we find in these large chunks are in a voice which is recognizably Aristotle's, but has a number of stylistic features which aren't mirrored in the Lyceum works. In particular, you find many double clauses, balance clauses, internal plays on negations and oppositions, such as you find in Isocrates in highly wrought literary rhetoric. So at one level, Aristotle is competing with Isocrates as a master of fine Greek prose. The style is pure Attic, and it's exemplary. It's wonderful. It actually carries you along. So one of the tests is once you have those chunks already that were achieved by the OSAP article, now what you do is you find similar chunks that connect with them, and the main and most reliable way is to use the same author with a different textbook, using obviously the same work. And so again, we're working through Iamblichus. If it weren't for Iamblichus, the problem would not be soluble. If you use Iamblichus properly, the problem is soluble. Again, you remove the Iamblichus and you find the voice of the author, Aristotle. And then the question now arises, if there are to be other fragments, such as papyrus fragments, how do we authenticate those as textually fragments? Because I think some papyrus fragments may well be fragments of the lost work. How do we know that? Here we are stuck in, well, not stuck. Here the resources would be that the papyrus style must be consistent with the voice of one of the three characters we already know, and that the papyrus, that the content of the speaker's speech must be in some kind of resonance or connection with the ideas you already have. If it doesn't sort of connect and begin to fuse or graft together with the rest of the work, I don't think it belongs. And there may be, of course, Aristotle's own words here and there in the various reception reports, that we have very little way of knowing what those are. And so for me, the possibility rises and falls with Iamblichus. And when you have enough information with Iamblichus, then you can probably ascertain that this is a little fragment from Aristotle with some papyri, if you're lucky to have papyri.
And let me just add a tiny addition to what Doug has just said. In the OSAP article, we limited ourselves to a minute comparison, sentence by sentence, letter by letter, of his excerption technique of Plato. At the time, we hadn't examined the same thing for some of the other chapters within the Iamblichus's Protrepticus, but it turns out there are other known works quoted in that book, including the so-called golden verses of Pythagoras, those things that Galen supposedly recited every morning and every evening before he went to bed. The golden verses of Pythagoras are quoted by Iamblichus, and we found that the method of quoting that exactly corresponded to what we saw with the Plato sections. So there was transitional comments at the very beginning and very end, and then there were transitional comments within that indicated a gap of where he was not quoting from the golden verses. Also, so he always quoted the golden verses exactly in order, and he always gave an exact unmodified quotation of them. And so yet further studies into Iamblichus have confirmed this technique. We have now seen it applied throughout the Protrepticus, and we've actually produced an English translation of the entirety of all 21 chapters of Iamblichus's Protrepticus, which shows this excerption technique. We have applied it to large parts of the DCMS and also the first book in the Iamblichus's Pythagorean sequence on the Pythagorean way of life. So we are very familiar with Iamblichus's own diction, his methods, his syntax, and the way he uses other sources. And it's very predictable, exactly as you would expect in somebody taking excerpts of classic works and putting them in a textbook to give to students. And so once we realized that, and we realized that it's not a matter of going through word by word and proving that every one of these words is attributable to Aristotle, the trick was removing the words of Iamblichus and leaving the source materials intact.
Thank you. Thank you, Monte. Thank you, Douglas. I don't know if someone wants to make a question from the public, so we can go with the second question and we prepare. I will try to copy it in the chat room. Yeah. But the second question is very large because I put some questions from the different members of the group, and it's related with the literary structure of the work. It is very interesting for us, your view of the literary structure as a dialogue and the indication of the different 4 characters. As someone of my colleagues said 3 characters, I said 4 characters because I recognize the unnamed anti-philosophy character. In this regard, we would like to know many things. The first question is, what do you understand about the Voice of Aristotle? What you told about that in some sense, and what aspects does it involve? A colleague from the South, she asked about the style, the morphosyntax, on the ideas. What would be the controversial objectives, as another calls, that Aristotle pursues by including Heraclitus as a third voice? And if you have any clue about the identity of the unnamed anti-philosophical speaker. And this is my last question, being so serious about the question of philosophy as a way of life, why Aristotle speak about his rivals in a comic or even in a parodic manner. We also want to ask about the performative characteristic of the dialogue. It's all related with the literary structure. I tried to say something in Spanish because I wrote all in English, pero a la gente le digo que las preguntas están todas relacionadas a la estructura del diálogo. Ahí las puse en inglés, si pueden leerlas, porque ahora se me haría muy largo traducir todo al español, pero si la pueden ver ahí, y resumí un poco las preguntas de los colegas en esa segunda pregunta. Si quieren, if you want to give you the floor again, if you want to answer the question, Monte or Doug.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yes, these are great questions.
Hi, David. David is saying goodbye. Thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you.
We are honored.
Yes, we are honored. Thank you so much, David. Good to see you.
It was a real pleasure. See you all soon, I hope.
Okay.
See you soon.
So yes, let's think seriously about what it means for this to be a dialogue, what it means for these to have these 3 speakers, what it means to be a Ciceronian dialogue, in a sense that the author speaker himself takes some kind of leading role and finishing role. Because yes, there are many things that you could do with this device. One thing that has to be said is that Aristotle was an innovator in the genre, but Heraclitus, the author, was before him an innovator in the genre. Heraclitus was the first person to write things that looked like Platonic dialogues and the whole tradition of dialogues, where the speakers were not in the past. They were living in the dialogues of Heraclitus. Now, Aristotle took that further, and he cast all of the speakers to be living speakers. And in fact, the speakers cast them all as authors. He himself was a published author. Heraclides was an author, and Isocrates was a famous, well-published author. And he made the speakers. He decided to make a dialogue with authors being speakers. Now that allowed him to make various intertextual connections between his own text and their texts by various kinds of citation, quotation, riffing, referring, and so forth. So these authors have their works brought into this work in some sense. And that was a very powerful innovation on the part of Aristotle. It's also a little bit unfair in the sense that these people published what they had to publish, and then Aristotle made various kinds of more or less fair appropriations of it, and wrote speeches as if they actually said that stuff. All right, it's as if I wrote a fictional dialogue, and my speakers were Henry Kissinger and Mikhail Gorbachev and Julian Assange. Okay, and the question is the U.S. a force for good in the world? Okay. So imagine I wrote this dialogue, and I could quote from Assange's speeches, and quote from Kissinger's speeches, and quote from Gorbachev's speeches, and then do this mishmash. And if I was one of them, or I could manipulate it so as to completely trounce them, especially if I slightly altered their meaning or their thoughts. So the technique of parody allows immense control, perhaps unfair control, on the part of the author who wants to manipulate the views of other authors. And that's why it was very appealing to Aristotle. It was also appealing to Aristotle because he was a scholar of comedy. He was an absolute huge fan of comedy. You can see this from various anecdotal stuff in his biography and from all the references in his text. He loved comedy, and so did Theophrastus, so did Menander. So comedy is the style, so to speak, for Aristotle, whereas it somewhat is the style for Plato to be in tragedy, I would say. But Aristotle writes a very, very clever dialogue. I wouldn't say it's flippant. Here's a very clever dialogue in which he takes clever shots at his two pro-philosophy rivals, so as to both co-opt them in the struggle to save philosophy from the attacks and to prove that he is a superior philosopher. Just don't bother with that academic nonsense, go with those academic people, and furthermore, not actually this kind of academic stuff, but the new, proper, modern academic philosophy, namely me, yours truly, Aristotle. Now, I can't personally give you any clue about the identity of the challenger of the speaker, but it looks like it would be somebody who came from the oratorical side and the political side, because the challenges, well, there may be challenges expressed in Theoxy 3659, which is a funny and interesting papyrus fragment against philosophy, which we think might be the challenge, or part of the challenge. But even if you accept that that is part of the challenge, I can't see any way of recognizing who that speaker is, except somebody who speaks for the public discourse and says, you know, you philosophers blame us in the political realm of disagreeing, but you wouldn't believe how much you philosophers disagree among yourselves. And so it's somebody who stands for
Yes, he says if you took a certain number of philosophers and had them in one room, and you took a certain number of madmen and put them in the room next door, you would have much, much greater disagreements and howls coming from the philosophers than from the madmen. And all we can do is compare it to other anti-philosophical apotreptic in the classical era, of which we have found quite a bit. Perhaps the most famous is Callicles in Plato's Gorgias, but there are others. And then there are uses. Every philosopher that gives a protreptic to their kind of philosophy also seems to give an apotreptic to false philosophy and fake philosophy. So we compare. That's a case where we see these occurring, and we see that Aristotle's responding to it, but we cannot pin down who exactly he characterized that role. But if anybody has any ideas, we'd love to hear about it. As for why Heraclides, why he included Heraclides, an academic colleague, but one who's very much interested in all of this theoretical philosophy and Pythagorean philosophy, there's a very neat balance, it seems, in the dialogue, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in response to one of the other questions. But in a way, there's a kind of Aristotle's view in the end is a synthesis of two positions. One that says that practical philosophy is real philosophy, and that's Isocrates' view, that theoretical philosophy, mathematical philosophy, that's not real philosophy. Real philosophy is politics, rhetoric, deliberation, that sort of thing. That's one concept of philosophy. And opposed to that, almost at another pole, is the idea that the practical world is worthless and we should all be focusing instead on the heavens and on the true nature of reality in a more kind of theoretical sense, and that theoretical philosophy is what really matters, not practical philosophy. And so there needs to be a voice to express that, somebody who has enthusiasms for theoretical philosophy but has no interest in doing rhetoric and politics and actually thinks those things beneath them. And the really brilliant rhetorical move of the overall dialogue that we've been able to discern is that Aristotle comes in and synthesizes these two views. Instead of rejecting both of these people, he combines them and says, you know what? Philosophy has a practical aspect and a theoretical aspect. And whether your interests lie in this practical dimension or theoretical dimension, the conclusion you have to reach is that you must do philosophy. And this, of course, is Aristotle's own concept and division of philosophy into theoretical on the one hand and practical and productive sciences on the other. And we can see through this work that he had already conceived of that all-important distinction and division between theory and practice, and also attempted to reunite them into one synthetic concept of philosophy. So that seems to be why Heraclides, a controversial Pythagoreanizing theoretical mathematical philosopher, is given such prominence in the work.
I've got another thing to say about that. For Aristotle to share the platform with Heraclides and himself is for him to provide a way of distinguishing his voice from that of Plato without Plato being on the scene. Heraclides stands in for Plato in certain ways, but in a sort of safe way. Heraclides says various things, and Aristotle says, we don't need to determine whether, as some think, other animals are degradations of humans, making a reference to the Platonic theory and saying, we don't need to talk about that, and maintaining in that sense a unified front with other academics on topics where they disagree. So he uses Heraclides to identify like a Platonic or Pythagorean aspect of the academic school that he's not on board with, except to the degrees where he expresses agreement with them. And so it allows him to distinguish himself and identify himself with respect to and in contrast with the Platonic stream of philosophy. Now, the Voice of Aristotle, what aspects does that involve? This voice of the character is a voice that expresses, number one, views that the author Aristotle also expresses. You don't find the character Aristotle saying wild and weird things about the soul. In fact, it's amazing how these beautifully constructed sentences never contradict the corpus in their contents. Just that they don't. One in the Voice of Aristotle. What is different between the corpus and this work is that the Voice of Aristotle can sometimes be really rather impressively constructed. And I want to just read out this in chapter 23. It's in the appendix. This is the part. This is our chapter that Merlin authenticated in 1953, and we accept it. We agree with that. And in this set, we're on page 24 of the whole package. And there's the first couple of paragraphs are a pretty good example of the voice of Aristotle as a writer. And when you see this voice in a source that might be Aristotle, then think, this could be the one.
So actually, Doug, let's give people a chance and ask them to actually turn to page 24.
24.
And because this will also help answer the earlier question about discerning Aristotle's voice from Iamblichus. What we have here is an entire chapter, 23, and it begins, and we've set in cursive or italics the words that we attribute to Iamblichus. This is very conventional. It opens with Iamblichus introducing his own chapter, then immediately going into fragments of Aristotle, which arguably consume the rest of the chapter until Iamblichus, as usual, draws a conclusion, which we've also set into italics. And I think that if you read those in Greek or in English or in a translation, you see, how very different the diction and the syntax is. Now, you wanted to call people's attention to the first couple of paragraphs there.
To the second and third paragraph, because the second paragraph expresses very clearly Aristotelian ideas, which you can parallel in other texts of the corpus, but here they are in perfectly drafted full sentences. We use the same criteria to posit one science as being more valuable than another, as we use to judge each one to be valuable. And we value one science over another, either because of its precision or because what it observes is better and more honorable. Of these sciences, while everyone would agree with us that it belongs especially to the mathematical sciences among them, there are, on the other hand, those who assign the seat of honor mentioned to the principles that are first, but they suppose the nature of the principle is proper to numbers and lines and their qualities because of the simplicity of its substance. And carrying on, this next paragraph is against Isocrates. Again, the objects that are observed in the heavens, here he's talking about mathematical astronomy, the objects that are observed in the heavens have the most honorable and most divine rank of the things perceptible to us and are naturally cognized by the science of astronomy, which is one of the mathematical sciences. But it would seem to be absurd and in no way to be agreed upon to assert that the philosopher has an affinity with the truth and also think it necessary for him to seek some other fruit from these kinds of observed objects, which have shared in the highest truth, and to be a lover of observations, and also think it right to acquire such sciences as these for something else, sciences which are about the most common things in nature, as well as about the most divine of things perceptible to us, sciences which, being full of the most numerous as well as the most amazing observations, have a precision and not molded from empty arguments, but are proper and secure from their underlying nature. And if you carefully work through that sentence, it is completely balanced and hangs in the air, just as impressive as a similarly extensive Isocratean sentence occupying a full page does. So here we have Aristotle, the writer, putting into his own character's voice his own ideas, but in the style of Isocrates. And so you see this this ability to engage in parody and imitation in the different voices of the dialogue.
Okay, I think we can go to the next question. I took one that you mentioned, Monte, about the relation of the practical and theoretical philosophy. If you mind, I put this question. I pasted on the chat, okay, y se lo traduzco a la gente, que Aristóteles, ellos dicen que estrictamente hablando los únicos pasajes protrépticos son los que sobrevivieron, son los de Política 7 y el final de la Ética Nicómaco, el libro 10, donde Aristóteles se refiere a la discusión de las formas de vida, de cuál era la mejor forma de vida, y en ambas obras parece resolver el problema, tanto a través del bios practicos, en el caso de Política 7, y de los distintos grados o niveles de la eudaimonía en el libro 10. Entonces, ustedes mencionaron ya cómo resuelve esa tensión entre las dos formas de vida en el protréptico. Esa es una de las preguntas que habíamos preparado. O sea, este problema, teniendo en cuenta la continuidad que establecen entre las tres obras éticas, ¿no? Protréptico, Ética Eudemo y Ética Nicómaco. Entonces, this is a question you mentioned that problem in just a few minutes before the relation.
The problem. La problema. La problema.
Yes, so I think here it would be good to point out another major aspect of the overall rhetorical structure of the work, which is that it gives a highly inclusive argument for why one should do philosophy. So practically the overall conclusion of the dialogue is that whatever your concept of the best way of life, whether it's pleasure or nobility or the life of the mind, in any case, you should do philosophy, and one must do philosophy. And Aristotle goes so far as to argue, and I think it's one of the most interesting arguments in the whole dialogue, and we've provided it in one of the appendices, that if you really want to have pleasure and enjoy life, do philosophy. I have to really explain this carefully to my students because they all agree with the hypothetical premise. Yes, I think that I want a pleasant life, but you have to explain why that, if they're really serious about that, they ought to do philosophy. And Aristotle goes so far as to argue that philosophers not only enjoy life more, but they actually live more. They're more alive. And then he argues about, with respect to those who their goal in life is practical action and nobility, how philosophy provides the necessary clarification for what the virtues are and to how to implement them and bring them about in actual political society. And then, of course, he explains why philosophy is critical if you want to have a serious intellectual life and life of the mind. So it is a general thing addressed to everyone. And the questioner that asked, you know, isn't there a problem with this general idea of addressing everyone and telling does he really mean everyone must do philosophy? And it's a really great question. I mean, one thing is we should ask whether we think that's actually true. But Aristotle does seem to argue that we all need to do some philosophy, whether we're absorbed in some theoretical consideration or whether we have some practical thing we're trying to work out, or even if we're just trying to enjoy our lives, we must do philosophy. Now, in the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics, famously, Aristotle argues that this contemplative theoretical life is the happiest life, the most eudaimon life. It's superior even to the way of life devoted to nobility and virtues. And it's, of course, a fortiori superior to a way of life devoted to pleasure seeking. And so that's more of an exclusive approach to reaching the conclusion that Aristotle wants. And so actually Aristotle exhorts to a much narrower point in the specialized work of the Nicomachean Ethics, which, as we were saying, is addressed to an audience that already wants to do some philosophy. They're interested in rhetoric and that sort of thing, but he's trying to get them focused on appreciating the theoretical aspects and devoting themselves more to the theoretical aspects. Whereas this exoteric, publicly circulating, published work that was actually read in a shoe shop in Athens at some point, according to a report about it, was meant to convince everyone, anyone in the audience. It doesn't matter what your goal is, it's going to be enhanced by doing philosophy. And it's an extremely powerful argument. I think a lot of there's one can raise problems with it, but it's one of the most powerful overall arguments for pursuing a philosophical way of life and for the importance of philosophy in every way of life.
And another way of putting this in a slightly shorter compass is if there is a problem as such, it's the old problem that Ackerl identified between inclusive and exclusive, that you find something rather inclusive in any one and something somewhat apparently exclusive in any 10. So what's the real Aristotle? The real Aristotle is inclusive, as he says in Protrepticus, and in any one. And we have to interpret the comments in any 10 as rhetorical as opposed to doctrinal. They're meant to steer certain people towards higher, more intellectual commitments, because those are the very people he's having to deal with there. But it's clear that in the strategy of any 10, there is a definite dismissal, rather brief and angry dismissal of the life of pleasure and amusing diversions in any 10-6, and so it reduces to 2. And he says, in a way, they're equally good, but one is more perfect than the other, or something like that. So it's like comparing 2 different infinities. If you think you can't have large infinities, well, that makes sense, but it's actually wrong. There can be a large infinity and a smaller infinity. And so Aristotle thinks that the life of the mind,
2 kinds of perfection.
Yes, the life of the mind is a higher perfection, or richer perfection than the other one, or something like that. But in fact, the true Aristotle is inclusive, and one gets a somewhat misleading impression by the rhetorical and demands that in a transition in any 10.
And of course, that's what most of the scholarship examining this issue and entire monographs that have been written have arrived at that conclusion. And the evidence for the view, direct evidence for it, was already available in these fragments of the Protrepticus. So in a way, it confirms what people took a very indirect route to arguing for.
It's very obvious in the Protapticus. It's so clear that the debate, it seems full when you read the Protapticus. So it's the core of the ethics. Yeah. It's very impressive. The other question is, I pasted there, is about, it's related with other works of from 2014, Protracted aspects of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. And let me see, because do you prefer to read? Considering the connection you established between the 3 ethics and the distinction between private and protaptic speech in your paper, Protaptic Aspects of the 2014, we want to ask 2 things. First, which are the main difference between the private protaptic speech and the public one? And the second, what could be the function of the protaptic speech addressed to everyone if its exaltative function is not so effective? Eso es una pregunta relacionada a un trabajo previo y en donde ellos establecen una diferencia entre la exhortación pública y la privada, y aparentemente lo que afirman es que es menos efectiva en el ámbito público. Entonces, un colega le pregunta a Diego Tabaquian por qué recurren al discurso, digamos, cuál sería la función del discurso protréptico en lo público, que está dirigido a todos y no solamente a los miembros de la escuela filosófica, cuál sería su función si no es tan efectiva. Esa es básicamente la pregunta.
I'll try to be much briefer here, as we've already commented on the point about him projecting this exhortation to everyone without exception and the maximally inclusive view of philosophy that he offers there. But it's a very, very good question. And the question about the difference between a private and a public protreptic. So in Rhetoric Book 1, Aristotle provides an official account of protreptic speech and apotreptic speech. It's the main, these are the two species of deliberative rhetoric. And deliberative rhetoric usually occurs in the context of public forums where people are debating issues like war, alliances, taxes, revenues, administration, things like that. And Aristotle says, you know, this is the heart of protreptic speech, but it's crucial for our purpose that he also says, but there is an application for protreptic in private speech to individual people. And we have a report that says the Protrepticus was addressed to an individual. The identity of that individual is very much in question, but it seems that he did word it as an individual kind of protreptic, but intended to circulate as an open letter. So open, as I said, that in the immediate next generation, it was being read in a shoemaker's workshop in Athens, and it was discussed by many other people. So the purpose of a private protreptic is to try to persuade an individual that they should change their behavior or come over to another way, another kind of activity that they weren't considering doing. And Aristotle words the Protrepticus so that it speaks to each individual person privately, but as we've said, inclusively to everyone. So that's one of the things that gives the rhetoric such incredible immediacy, is that it is speaking to every single individual as if it was a private encouragement and exhortation to them to pursue philosophy, but it applies to a universal, an absolutely universal audience.
Right, but I think there's part of the question is this: since it's pretty obvious that the book will end up in the hands of many people who reject it, then why is it addressed to everybody? Because and the answer is that this is part of the technology of a book. You don't address your books, hey, some of you people, I'm not talking to you, you address absolutely universally everybody who picks up the book in the same way. Books are promiscuous, as Plato says in the Phaedrus. They fall into everybody's hands. And so it's part of the new technology of books that travel all across the Mediterranean in the traffic of wine and grain and goods and books and leather and whatnot. Books began to travel, and books traveled as commodities suddenly. And in this new technology of books as commodities, the universal address is part of the technology. And of course, but advertisers know that they won't get everybody to buy that soap, but they still say that everybody should buy the soap. And politicians know that their deal won't be cut by everybody, but everybody should vote for me. It's an artifact of the communicative stance and process. It's not an assumption that's going to work for everybody.
Thank you. The next question is about, I think it's about metaphysics.
And feel free just to read the Spanish version of that. We
okay. Yeah. La pregunta es, lo que pasa es que ahora tengo que traducir en español. I have to translate to Spanish. ¿Cuál es el material protréptico que Aristóteles recicla en la metafísica y por qué, ustedes lo explicaron, hicieron referencia, por qué no constituye un discurso protéptico si también supone un elogio a la filosofía, una invitación a practicarla y como la forma más alta de conocimiento? Esa es la pregunta. Además, quiero decir, I want to say, if someone wants to ask another question, we have prepared this one, but if someone from the audience wants to ask something, we are open for that. But this is the one that we prepared. Sorry.
And Viviana, I'm absolutely in awe of your bilingual capabilities here and how well you are managing all this and back translating. It's truly impressive, and we really appreciate it. The question actually goes to a point that we have discussed a lot back and forth, and I think it's a sort of a touchy subject. So whoever asked this really honed in on a crucially important issue. Now, it turns out that Jaeger had claimed that the first part of the Metaphysics contains unedited excerpt from the Protrepticus. Roughly the first 2 chapters he thinks is just taken out of the Protrepticus and put in. And we don't actually disagree very much with him about the issue of whether there is an influence from the Protrepticus to this. It does seem like that kind of material. So to that extent, there is protreptic. There is a use of and a recycling of protreptic material. The exact question to ask is, how much is there a protreptic to first philosophy or to theology, to what we call metaphysics itself in those chapters? And that turns out to be a slightly more difficult question to answer than we realize. So first of all, in support of I think the questioner's view, quite a few arguments within here that parallel what Aristotle tells us in the Rhetoric we should expect of a protreptic speech. Many recommended tropes, for example, comparing the values of different kinds of sciences, arguing that some sciences are more valuable than others and ought to be pursued and are more inclusive and have more excellent objects and so forth. And so to that extent, there does seem to be a kind of protreptic to doing first philosophy. But it's the kind of protreptic that you give not to the general public or even to people that are not very willing, for example, to do dissection of animals and so forth, like we find in the Parts of Animals, but more like if you were telling students in a graduate seminar on metaphysics that they should really get into this new category theory stuff or this new modal way of doing metaphysics. They're all doing and interested in this material anyway. What you're trying to encourage them to do is approach it the way you think it should be approached. And so that is a kind of protreptic, but it should be distinguished from the idea of encouraging them to change their way of life and undertake an entirely new kind of activity. And I'll just say that there is a great new article coming out in a volume we've been working on the Protrepticus and the Aristotle corpus. Thomas Johansson has authored a new article that argues that the beginning of metaphysics 1-2, does contain a protreptic, and Aristotle is exhorting us to a specific new kind of science. And it's a very convincing article. And in the same book, there is a contribution by Fabienne Bagdasarian, who looks at metaphysics book Lambda, the one on theology, and she raises the question, well, to what extent has Aristotle delivered on what he was exhorting to in the earlier chapters? Has he now sort of done this theology and here it is? And she says that in a way he has accomplished what he set out to do there. And so that might be another reason why there's kind of a subdued protreptic there. Aristotle isn't really saying, go do this new form of study and find out new things about it. It's more like, pay attention to what I'm going to argue, and I'm going to have a new account of this, and it's going to resolve a lot of these issues. So in general, what we do with these works in the corpus is use the extent of protreptic material in them in order to gauge Aristotle's own concept of where he wants to push his students to get involved. So it's incredible that there is no protreptic or minimal protreptic throughout the entire organon. But the reason for that seems to be the reason that he gives in that chapter at the end of the Sophistical Refutations, when he says, I have developed and completed this inquiry into this. It's done. And of course, Immanuel Kant, 2000 years later, said, ever since Aristotle put this down, we haven't needed to do one iota more of work on it, apparently buying Aristotle's claim. So there's no protreptic to do syllogism or something, because Aristotle worked that part out and solved that. And in the metaphysics, it seems to be a case where he's not encouraging people to undertake an entirely new thing, and certainly not a new way of life, but to just see things the way that he does. So it's a modulated protreptic, but it's a great question, and one that we are actually still working on.
Thank you. We have just a few more questions just to finish. Let me paste the next one. Yes, Claudia Sucharo asked the next one. I read it in Spanish.
Yes.
I prefer. Teniendo en cuenta su trabajo de 2018, Protreptic y a Protreptic, Aristotle's Protapticus Dialogue, ¿qué piensan acerca de la relación entre la aplicación de la dialéctica y la adaptación del género protréptico, el cual parece involucrar procedimientos característicos del primero, como la refutación y el uso de endoxy, ¿no? de opiniones generalmente admitidas? This is the question that one of the questions Claudia formulates.
Okay, that's a hard one.
Yes, thank you, Claudia.
The use of generally admitted opinions, let's start with that. It's a very prominent part of Aristotle's method in the Ethics and in some other works. Yes, there's definitely evidence of that in the Protrepticus. He seems to have had a particular interest in proverbs and in which he called, in this work, of course, another one, relics of ancient wisdom. And he has a great interest in responsible and respectable expressions of wisdom which have survived a long time, and because they must have some grasp or aspect of the truth. And so you see that respect for the preserved wisdom, both in his self-conscious method in the Lyceum works, and also as part of the strategy of the Protrepticus, because they start with some old wisdoms and old proverbs and maxims, and go from there into more complex theoretical territory. Now, dialectic. I mean, Aristotle clearly was a master of argumentation, and we see it in the dialogue, perhaps in that famous Miraculous argument. He's able to make that opponent fall down in an impressive way. And that's, if you like, live dialectic. It's dialectic of people having an argument against each other. There's another kind of dialectic you find in the Aristotle corpus, which involves the analysis of received opinions or likely or theoretical opinions, and the analysis of them in various fine-grained forms. And you do find some versions of that, even though it's rather technical, in this work. And I want to just draw your attention to one of the passages we have in this collection of passages. It's on page 28. Here we've got a translation of the last two chapters of the dialogue. And we find Aristotle using logical subtleties of a kind that are very impressive, but are not useless. And so in this passage, he's displaying how he can manage dialectical subtleties while doing that. So I'm on the first paragraph on page 28. And I'll read it once, and it's okay if you don't understand it the first time because it's dense and subtle, but it does make sense. Drinking while feeling pleasure is one thing, and drinking with pleasure is another. For nothing prevents someone who is not thirsty or has not been offered the drink he enjoys from enjoying himself while drinking, not because he is drinking, but because it occurs at the same time as he sits there that he is observing or being observed. Thus, we will assert that this fellow is having pleasure and is drinking while feeling pleasure, but not by drinking, and not because he is drinking with pleasure. Thus, in the same way, we will also say that walking and sitting and learning in every process is pleasant or distressing, not insofar as it turns out that we feel distress or pleasure in their presence, but insofar as we are all distressed by or enjoy their presence. So similarly, we will also say that life is pleasant if its presence is pleasant to those who have it, and that not all in whom it occurs that they enjoy themselves while living are living with pleasure, only those to whom living itself is pleasant and who enjoy the pleasure that comes from life. Well, that's a really, really subtle piece of writing. And you have to read it several times to understand that it's really valid. It's really correct. It's really quite interesting. And he's displaying subtle things from Eck for this and other kinds of concepts that he's constantly using in the rest of his work. And so in certain passages, you find him, so to speak, using the same paintbrush kit of dialectic that he uses in the Lyceum works.
And this passage that Doug just read part of has recently been studied by Katerina Iridiaconou, who has written a paper for this volume I was mentioning on the Protrepticus and the Aristotle corpus, which analyzes the way that this argument employs tropes discussed in Aristotle's Topics, which of course is his official account of dialectic. So actually recommended schemes and forms of argumentation in the Topics can be shown to have been deployed here. And then the last thing about dialectic I would mention is our overall conception of the dialogue, where there's this dialectic, as it were, between practical philosophy, theoretical philosophy, and the attempt to synthesize them into one overarching argument for why one should do philosophy.
Thank you. The last question from Claudia is more specific. It's about a paper, la voy a leer en español, sobre un trabajo de Constantine. Ella menciona Competing Arts, Medicine and Philosophy, la acabo de pegar. Según ese trabajo, el Protéptico no fue escrito solo para confrontar a Sócrates, sino contra cierta literatura médica antigua, y ella le pregunta si cree que esa tesis es plausible y en ese caso qué personaje representaría esa concepción y si podría estar relacionado con las endoxae aristotélicas. Esa sería la pregunta de Claudia. Thank you, Monte.
Okay, so this was a new contribution for me, and I had to look it up, but I did find it. The author's name is Mihai. Constantine is the first name, the last name is Mihai, and it's sure enough it's a Romanian publication from 2017. And the argument is that by the way, this fellow Mihai also was a translator of the Romanian translation of Protapticus. And his thesis here in this talk is that there was in this period some kind of competition between experts in medicine and so-called experts in philosophy as to who had the master skill or the highest skills, and that there's some evidence of competition between medicine and philosophy in Aristotle Protapticus. So one of the questions is, well, what speaker would that be? And the answer is, no, there is no medicine speaker here. We have absolutely no reason to think that there's a speaker who represents medicine in here. However, this scholar's belief that Aristotle is in touch with theorists of medicine and has attitudes about them is correct. And the evidence that he points to, which is from the beginning of chapter 10, in which is the chapter in which Aristotle says you have to have profound natural theory to do philosophy properly. It starts this way: just as the doctors who are sophisticated, and most of those concerned with athletic training, pretty much agree that those who are to be good doctors or athletic trainers must be experienced throughout nature. So in the same way, good legislators must be experienced about nature too. And then also other material intervenes, but that's, those comments are paralleled, as he says, in a few other places in the biological works. And what that indicates to me is that Aristotle is aware that there are in the physical training world two kinds of doctors, two kinds of gymnasts, the more theoretical and the less theoretical, the more empirical and the less empirical, okay? Likewise, within the doctor tradition, there are doctors who are more theoretical and who are less theoretical. And we have good evidence of this in the 4th century, of divisions between the more theoretical and the more empiricist traditions of medicine. So that's why Aristotle says, with rather a lot of qualifications here, those doctors who are sophisticated, the compsoi, not all doctors, just certain kinds, and most of those peritin gymnastikae, in the field of gymnastics, and then they agree, skate on, pretty much. So he's using the somewhat fragile agreement of some other people, at least the theoretical ones, that their craft requires theory to prosper, and taking their side against the side of medical empiricists that were already expressing their views in, for example, on ancient medicine. So there is a connection. Aristotle does know his history of medicine. Aristotle knows his field quite well, and but it's not that he's trying to say that philosophy is a higher skill than medicine. It's just that he, following Plato, is committed to the view that the soul is a bigger deal than the body. And that's not really in competition with medicine. It's a different conception of the human person. And since the soul is more important than the body, then the science which helps the soul must be in some sense higher and more significant than the science that helps the body. So I don't think it's really a competition, which is the first idea, but really just employing the Platonic analogy and actually agreeing with the, he said so many times, the soul is more important than the body.
Let me just add 2 tiny points. We should have mentioned that there has been identified another protreptic within the Aristotle corpus, which is the protreptic to scientific medicine in the Parva Naturalia, in 2 different parts of the Parva Naturalia, one of which Doug just quoted, the part about sophisticated doctors. According to a paper by Pierre-Marie Morel, coming into the volume that I mentioned on protreptic and the Aristotle corpus, he argues that Aristotle does give a protreptic there to a more philosophical approach to medicine. The second thing is just a kind of off-the-wall idea that occurred to me for this. Perhaps one could think that the anti-philosophical voice conceivably could be one of the medical writers, because there are these treatises in the Hippocratic corpus that attack philosophy entirely, or at least attack the value of philosophy for medicine. And as Constantine points out, that there is this large rivalry, and so perhaps that gives some kind of clue as to the characterization of somebody who might want to argue against philosophy in general.
Okay, Marcus, this is your name. Yes, Sattler asked me to make another question. I'm gonna, can you paste it, please, in the chat and for all? I'm gonna read it. I have to read it in English because I didn't read it first. Concerning the so-called miraculous argument of the Protapticus, we know that this argument not only was reproduced also in Cicero's Hortensius, but there are also seems to be some evidence indicating that it's precisely thanks to this argument that the character of Hortensius was, converted to philosophy in the homonymous dialogue. Is there any indication at all in any of the existing testimonies that the miraculous argument played a similar important role also in the Protapticus?
I'm sorry, I read it very bad because the first time, but do you understand it?
That was perfect. Yeah, I understood you. We understood you perfectly. And thank you very much for the question. And who is it coming from again?
From Matteo Stetler in Australia.
Matteo,
Oh,
sorry,
okay.
I confused the name. Sorry, Mateos.
Yeah.
No, thank you for the question, Matteo. And by the way, I refer you to this paper where we have discussed the logic of the argument at some length, and also looked carefully at the parallel in the Hortensius, which, as you say, there's a report and it's treated as a fragment of the Hortensius, according to which Hortensius was skewered by this argument, couldn't escape it, and he admitted that he must do philosophy. It seems to us that the argument in Aristotle had a much more limited use. Now, Hortensius is characterized as an anti-philosopher. He's pro-rhetoric, and he's a bit like a latter-day Isocrates who doesn't represent his own activity as being any kind of philosophy, but as being in competition with philosophy. And so that's a bit of a different situation, a rhetorician attacking philosophy, almost more like a Callicles-like figure, defending rhetoric and devaluing philosophy. But the general way that the argument seems to be put seems to require a response to somebody making an argument against philosophy. And as we've seen, that's a soft spot in our evidence base, and Iamblichus certainly wasn't interested in reproducing an argument against all of philosophy in his own monological protreptic to philosophy. And so we actually interpret it as having a more limited function that disposes with the generic anti-philosophical argument and moves on to the determination, since we're all agreed we must do some form of philosophy, the determination of which kind of philosophy we should do. And we can't see how that argument would function in the other arguments that are used, which seem to presuppose a commitment to philosophy, but a conception that it ought to be limited either to a practical or a theoretical purpose. And so it looks like this could be a case where Cicero creatively redeployed that very impressive and very dialectical trapping argument, which several other sources comment on in the Greek tradition as well, and report that argument to us. It's the kind of argument that, you know, works well at cocktail parties and that sort of thing, but it doesn't seem to get you very far, even really against someone who's doesn't make an argument against philosophy, but just rejects the practice altogether, and doesn't offer a speech against it.
Yeah, I would say that we don't. I'm not inclined to think that the narrative in Aristotle Protrepticus was that this speech, the speaker who challenged philosophy, then becomes a convert to philosophy, because he's none of the three main speakers who support philosophy. He gets a kind of reply from Aristotle, but it's, as Monte says, it's clearly not substantial enough for Aristotle's main purposes in the whole dialogue. It's just a kind of initial fireworks showing how clever he can be, I think. I think that we have to suppose that the speaker is not defeated, because if he were, there'd be no reason for the three more speeches to defend philosophy against those attacks. And so I think that we have to suppose that although Aristotle put probably in his own mouth this clever response, Aristotle, the author, never believed that was sufficient, and he didn't believe that it would persuade that character. I think that he left the question open, and maybe with more considerations on their side, so as to motivate a response by his three main speakers. Good question, though. I mean, yeah, and that raises the point to what degree we use the Hortensius for reconstructing the Protrepticus. But I would say the way it's going now, there's much more evidence developing and growing in the Protrepticus of Aristotle than the Hortensius of Cicero. So it's likely that the latter work, the Cicero, will be learning and getting new information from the Aristotle and not vice versa. Looks like there's more light to shed.
Which is inverts the situation in the 19th century, where the assumption was we have all this solid information about the Hortensius, so let's try to find out a little about the Protrepticus. It turns out that inspired an effort where we actually can know quite a bit about Aristotle's Protrepticus, and the hope is that Latin scholars, Cicero scholars, will then be able to reinterpret, rearrange, and reconceive of their evidence base in light of a more firm conception of what Aristotle's work was.
Okay, thank you. We are finishing. You answered the other questions about the genre during your talk, and you answered me, and it's very clear that you remove from the shelves of the non-read works the Protapticus. Is it clear? But I was playing with your own words. The last question is, we would like to know as a group, what are the next steps of your research project, and when do you plan to publish your critical edition, translation, and commentary of the work? Do you estimate? When do you estimate you will finish, or you don't have a date till now?
Well, we didn't have plans to finish until recently, because we had problems, and the problems were with how to set up a reconstruction which could be revised in the light of future responsible scholarship. And so the trick is to set up something which is both stable and flexible. And that paradox was impossible. Like, we couldn't work it out for a long time. And the solution we think is going to work, and we had no negative feedback from this group, and also from a group in the Czech Republic where I presented these ideas. The idea is to separately present and catalog the evidence and separate that question from the reconstruction, and do it in 2 stages. And that seems to be the stage that opens up that takes away the obstacle. The next stages are to produce, develop the commentary sections. We have new editions of the Greek of the Protrepticus chapters. We have the manuscripts. We have not done new editions of the Greek of the DCMS chapters, and we want to find if we can put a limit to them. We want to find out whether we can stop at 27 and start at 22, or whether we have to go further. And that could take a while, I guess. But for me, the technique is to, if this is working, to expand this material and then just simply write the commentary. And then the next stage, which is a bit daunting, is to go back once we've written the book and then start rereading all the old scholarship. But you have to do that, then you got to put in references at the appropriate places. Otherwise, you can't just mention them 1 or 2 places. You have to mention in the commentary here, in this part there, and so forth. And so there's going to have to be a review of the history of scholarship, and that should collect all the published material that needs to go into commentary.
And part of the difficulty of that is that, for example, with respect to our 2005 OSAP article, has already been cited more than 100 times and in 10 PhD theses. So people have already started building on our work and using it. And so now, of course, we naturally must take that into account. And in all of these languages, articles in Spanish, articles in Italian, articles in French, Greek, etc. So that's really the most challenging thing, is now incorporating all of the results that have already, recently been happening. But the major parts of the work, identifying what the big areas, outstanding areas that needed to be surveyed for fragments, has been done. And we personally inspected in several European libraries the main manuscripts, to the point we were able to propose a stemma of all of the manuscripts of Iamblichus's work. We translated all of Iamblichus's work, all 21 chapters, just as an instrumental project to make sure that we understood how he was excerpting it. And we have produced critical editions with critical apparati for all of the Greek evidence that we're attributing to the work. So it depends on when you're asking us and what time of day, in the early morning or at night, how optimistic we are about its finishing. And we certainly would not propose any date that it will be finished. But we can promise you this, that we'll continue publishing it, putting it up on the internet, making it available to people, and inviting them to give us whatever comments or whatever questions they have about it. And in a way, this is what has really pushed this work forward, is other people working on it and believing in the project and supporting us and incorporating it into their own work. And so in a way, it'll be disappointing if we ever finish this up.
Okay.
And also people will continue, hopefully, to take it onward from there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all this material, for allowing people to see how to produce a critical edition, how difficult it is. So it's a great work you are doing, and you're sharing with the academic community. If there's no other question, Monte gently offers to send emails to anyone who wants to ask him. We can finish this virtual encounter. Thank you so much again for generosity, for your disposition. It was a great experience for our group, and I would say for our academic community. And paraphrasing Aristotle again, Aristotle's Protapticus, we did not need a special place to listen to you touching the truth as if you were present here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Viviana. That was beautiful, and we really appreciate your bilingual efforts here and on the part of everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everything. In Spanish, quiero decir que para finalizar quiero agradecer en nombre del Grupo GEA al público presente, a todas las personas que se acercaron de distintos países, a los expositores, al director del INEO por su apoyo, a Ricardo Ibarlucía, y a cada uno de los integrantes que han hecho posible este evento. Por último, queremos invitarlos a la próxima conferencia que tendrá lugar el día 20 de mayo en este mismo horario, y que dictarán los profesores Giulia Angelini, que está aquí presente, de la Universidad de Padua, Italia, y Manuel Berrón, de la Universidad del Litoral, que se ha tenido que retirar, y hablarán seguramente sobre el libro 1 de la política de Aristóteles, así que los esperamos a todos y a todas, y muchísimas gracias. Have a good evening. Buenas noches a todos.
Entonces.
No se apaga hasta que no cerramos el último. Yo me paso, por eso los espero.
Muy bueno, Viviana, tu traducción, excelente.
Gracias, chicos. Ahora sí apagamos, así corta el CONICET, ¿vale? Después nos comunicamos. Gracias, Un beso grande. Buen fin de.